Why is my father's name in the king's private order?
Because the crown killed him.
And you hid the proof?
No.
I was waiting for you.
You will not go.
The king has already signed the order.
Then we ride before dawn.
And if they follow?
They will.
The candle guttered in its brass holder as Elara pressed herself against the shelves of Duke Cassian Vael's private study and listened. Boots, on the marble corridor. 2 sets, perhaps 3, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who carried royal authority like a second skin. She should not be here. The chamber was known throughout the palace simply as the East Wing study A room that had no place on any servant's map, that appeared in no household ledger, and whose single-arched door was kept sealed with a lock that required not 1 key but 2 kept by the Duke himself, and 1, she had recently discovered, kept by the palace's chief steward under personal instruction from the king. No one entered this room. The staff had been told it held the Duke's private correspondence, his financial records. Nothing unusual, nothing that would quicken anyone's pulse, nothing that should make Elara's hands shake the way they shook now, holding the document she'd found beneath the loose flagstone under the oak writing desk. It was a single page of thick vellum, sealed once in dark red wax-knot sealing wax, but something thicker, more permanent, and then broken open and refolded, as if it had been read and reread many times over many years. The handwriting was formal, official, bearing the king's private crest embossed at the top corner. Her eyes had moved down the page with the practiced speed of a woman trained from girlhood to absorb information quickly and completely. Her father had taught her that. Dr. Aldred Oren, court physician, had always said that the most important skill a person could possess was not swordsmanship or courtly grace. It was the ability to read a room or a document before the room read you. She had the document nearly committed to memory before the 3rd line stopped her cold. Her father's name, not in recognition, not in gratitude or appointment, in accusation. The physician Aldred Oren, in possession of knowledge detrimental to the continued peace of this realm, was removed from court service on the 14th day of October in the year of the Crown's mercy, under direct order of His Royal Majesty King Aldrich Vael. His subsequent death was ruled consistent with natural causes. It is the express purpose of this document to record the truth, that the physician's death was ordered to prevent his testimony at the inquiry into the death of the former king, whose passing attributed to fever was, in fact, administered by. The boots stopped outside the door. Elara moved. She had 3 seconds to fold the document and press it back into the cavity beneath the flagstone. 3 seconds to straighten and cross to the shelves furthest from the desk, dragging her gaze across the leather spines with an expression of perfectly arranged curiosity. The lock turned. The door swung open on a draft of cold corridor air that smelled of torch fire and winter stone. 2 of the king's household guards stepped in first. Behind them, a tall figure filled the doorway not in the red and gold of the royal household, but in charcoal gray, sword at his hip, dark eyes sweeping the room with the measuring focus of a man who catalogued everything and trusted nothing. Duke Cassian Vael was not a man who arrived anywhere without knowing exactly what he would find. And yet for one fractional, impossible moment, when his gaze settled on Elara standing at his shelves, something moved behind those eyes that she could not name. Not anger, not calculation. Something close to dread. "Leave us," he said to the guards without looking at them. They hesitated. Household guards of the king's employ did not take orders from the Duke in the king's own palace. "Now," he said, and his voice dropped to something so quiet and so absolute that both men stepped back through the doorway and pulled it closed behind them without another word. Elara kept her face still. She was good at keeping her face still. She had been doing it her whole life. "Lady Elara." Cassian crossed the room in measured strides, each footfall deliberate on the stone. He stopped at the desk. He did not look at the floor. He looked at her. "What brings you to my study?" "I was told this corridor led to the library's overflow collection," she said. Her voice was smooth, unhurried, betraying nothing. "I must have misread the steward's directions." He was quiet for a long moment. A lesser man would have accepted that answer. A polite fiction, a credible excuse, and everyone could walk away with dignity intact. Duke Cassian Vael was not a lesser man. He moved to the shelves beside her, not threatening, simply close, and tilted his head to examine the same spines she had been examining. His sleeve brushed her arm. "There are no books in this room," he said pleasantly, "that bear any resemblance to a library's collection. Everything here is encrypted correspondence and personal record. A woman looking for readable material would have turned and left within seconds. He paused. You have been here for considerably longer than that. Elara met his gaze. For the first time, she allowed herself to actually look at him, not the careful, glancing assessments she usually employed in the presence of powerful men, but a direct and open examination. She had seen Cassian Vael at court dinners, at formal audiences, at the kind of social functions where nobility moved through rooms like chess pieces on a board, performing roles rather than living them. She had formed her impressions at a distance, cold, controlled, brilliant and dangerous in the way that very intelligent, very powerful men tended to be when they wanted something. Up close, he was something else entirely. There was a tension around his jaw that she recognized, not anger, but something more precise. Worry. He was worried. And beneath that, barely perceptible unless you had spent years learning to read the quiet spaces between what people showed and what they felt, was something that looked very much like relief. As if her presence here, dangerous as it was, had resolved some private calculation. She filed that away. I think, she said carefully, that you already know why I'm here. Something shifted in his expression. He turned from the shelf and walked to the window, looking out over the darkened courtyard below. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that she had to move closer to hear him. How much did you read? She considered lying. She was capable of it, but she had the distinct impression that Duke Cassian Vael would know and that a lie detected now would cost her more than the truth. Enough, she said. He turned. Then you understand, he said, that you have just made yourself extraordinarily dangerous to the crown, and that the crown, he added, with a flatness that made her breath catch, has very specific methods for managing that kind of danger. Elara held his gaze. My father, she said, and the two words were barely above a whisper. Cassian did not look away. Your father, he said, was the bravest man I have ever met, and I am sorry, more than you know. The silence between them was not empty. It was full to its edges with things neither of them could yet afford to say. The days that followed wore the mask of normality with unnerving skill. The palace continued its choreographed rhythms, morning audiences, afternoon courts, the endless procession of nobility performing deference to a king who wore his crown like a weapon. Elara moved through it all with the same composed grace she had cultivated since childhood, attending to her duties in the household of the Duchess Margrave, appearing at meals, responding to invitations. She did not speak to Cassian again, not that week, but she felt him watching her. Not in the way that men at court sometimes watched her appraisingly, possessively, as though beauty were a resource to be assessed and acquired. This was different. It was the watching of a man doing a calculation, measuring a variable he had not expected to find in his equation, and trying to determine whether it changed everything. She found herself doing the same. In quiet moments during the long afternoon readings the Duchess preferred, or in the half-hour before dawn when the palace had not yet assembled itself into its daily performance, she thought about the document. She thought about the line that had stopped her cold, her father's name, laid out in royal script with the flat certainty of an official verdict. She thought about what it would mean to have known, for 8 years, that she had been lied to, and then to discover someone else had been carrying the same truth, building a case around it in a locked room, brick by patient brick. On the evening of the 5th day, he appeared at her elbow during the transition between courses at Lord Fenwick's dinner and said, without preamble and without looking at her, walk with me. It was not a request. They moved through the corridor leading to the eastern terrace, where the night air held the last warmth of early autumn and the palace gardens spread below them in the silver dark. Cassian stopped at the balustrade and turned to face the garden rather than her. A posture she was beginning to understand was how he said things he had not prepared himself to say. I need you to understand your position, he said. I understand it perfectly, she replied. No. He turned then, and the moonlight caught the severity of his profile. I don't think you do. Knowing what you know, you are not merely inconvenient to the king. You are... He paused, a breath that was nearly imperceptible. A thread in a tapestry that, if pulled, unravels something that King Aldrich has spent 20 years weaving. He will not leave that thread loose. You've been pulling at that tapestry yourself, she said quietly. The documents in that room. You've been collecting evidence for years. He said nothing, which was its own answer. Why? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. His hand rested on the stone balustrade between them, and she noticed again what she had noticed in the study of faint tremor, not fear, something that cost him more than fear. Because the man whose death your father witnessed, he said, was my father. The garden continued its indifferent rustling below. Somewhere in the hedgerows a nightbird called once and went silent. The previous king, she said slowly. The one the document was my father, he said again. My mother was his wife before the marriage was annulled on grounds that the royal council now knows were fabricated. I was 9 years old. I was told he died of fever. I was told many things. He turned back to the garden. Your father was the only living witness who had documented what actually killed him. His testimony, had it been delivered at the inquiry, would have dismantled everything Aldrich built his reign on. Elara's mind moved through it quickly, the pieces clicking into place with the terrible precision of a mechanism designed to destroy. Her father's death ruled natural causes, the sealed document hidden beneath a locked flagstone. Cassian, collecting evidence for years with the patience and fury of a man who had been waiting for a specific moment. You're the legitimate heir, she said. I am a duke, he said flatly, and a very careful one. You're the legitimate heir, she repeated. And the man you need to bring that proof before is the very man who had your own father murdered. He did not answer, because she was right. She looked at him, this controlled, dangerous, quietly relentless man, and something in her chest did something she had no architecture for. Not sympathy, exactly. Something harder and cleaner. Recognition. She had spent 8 years living inside the truth of her father's death, while the official story sat over it like a stone. She knew what it was to carry a grief that the world had decided was something else entirely. The tremor in your hand, she said. It happens when you talk about him. Cassian's jaw tightened. You notice that. I notice most things, she said. My father taught me. He looked at her then directly, fully. Without the careful management she had come to expect from him, and what she saw in his expression was something that might, in another life and another moment, have been the beginning of something dangerous. Lady Elara, he said, I need you to be very careful, more careful than you have ever been. I know. I mean it. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines of tension at the corners of his eyes, the controlled restraint of a man who wanted to say more than the situation safely allowed. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't speak of what you read. And if anyone asks anyone, you were never in that study. She met his eyes and held them. And you? Something moved across his face, quick, involuntary, gone almost before she could catalog it. I have managed this for 3 years, he said. You've been managing it alone for 3 years, she said. He had no answer for that either. They stood in the autumn dark for a moment longer, the garden below them and the palace behind them, and something unspoken occupying the precise distance between them. Then he straightened, inclined his head, and walked back inside without another word. She stood at the balustrade a while longer after he left, looking at the dark shapes of the garden below, and she thought that whatever was happening between them was not something either of them had planned, which meant, she supposed, that it was probably real. Lord Edric arrived on a Tuesday under the gracious pretense of a diplomatic exchange with the northern lords. He was a narrow man, precise in his movements, with the kind of pleasant face that was specifically designed to be forgotten soft features, mild eyes, a conversational manner that put people at ease in the same way that still water put travelers at ease before they walked into the current. Elara identified him as the king's spymaster within 30 seconds of watching him work the room at the Duchess Margrave's welcome reception. She had been trained to notice the ones who listened more than they spoke. Edric listened to everything. He moved through the reception with the appearance of social enjoyment, laughing at the right moments, complimenting the right people, accepting wine from a passing tray and holding it without drinking. His eyes, behind all that pleasant arrangement, never stopped moving. They catalogued, they assessed, they lingered, for just a fraction too long, on the faces of people who did not know they were being measured. They lingered on Elara. She looked away before their eyes could meet, turning to Lord Pemberton beside her with a remark about the portrait above the fireplace. But she felt it, the specific quality of professional scrutiny, the kind that leaves a trace on the skin even after the gaze has moved on. She found Cassian at the edge of the room, holding a glass he had not touched. Their eyes met over the width of the gathering. She made the smallest possible gesture, just a tilt of her head toward Edric's general location. Something in Cassian's expression tightened imperceptibly, but he held still, gave a fractional nod, and looked away. They had developed a language of almost nothing. Elara had not intended it. It had simply evolved. the way that two people who cannot speak freely begin to communicate through the spaces between words. She spent the rest of the reception doing precisely what her father had taught her, moving normally, speaking normally, filing every detail that Lord Edric's presence displaced, who he spoke to, how long, what shifted in their expressions afterward. She noted that he spent 12 minutes with the Duchess Margrave's personal secretary far longer than a purely social exchange warranted. She noted that he did not speak to Cassian at all, which was more interesting than if he had. Men like Edric did not avoid powerful lords by accident. By the time the reception ended and the guests filtered into their separate evenings, she had a map of his first night in the palace as clear as if she'd drawn it on paper. Edric was not here for diplomacy. He was here to find a loose thread, and she was beginning to understand with cold, specific certainty exactly how loose she was. She found Petra at the end of the corridor outside her chamber door, not standing, not sitting. Folded at the base of the door like a garment someone had dropped, her small body curled on its side, breathing in the shallow, broken rhythm of someone who had been struck hard and recently. Elara was on her knees in an instant, hands moving through the physician's assessment her father had drilled into her before she could recite her own court precedence breathing. Pulse, pupils, injury. Petra. She kept her voice low, level. Petra, look at me. The girl's eyes opened dark, frightened, swimming with pain. My lady, she whispered. The note. They left a note. The folded paper was pinned to the inside of Petra's collar with a brooch that did not belong to her. A plain gold pin, the kind a man would wear. The kind that cost precisely enough to be significant without being memorable. Elara unpinned it with fingers that were absolutely steady. She unfolded the note with those same steady fingers and read the single line of elegant script within, and felt something underneath her breastbone turn to ice. The crown does not bargain with those who read its secrets. She sat beside Petra on the cold corridor floor and held the girl's hand and thought with the focused, clinical clarity her father had given her, a gift she had never been more grateful for than at this precise, terrible moment, and she thought about the weight of what she was carrying and the precision with which the king had just communicated his awareness of it. He knew that she had been in the study. He knew what she had read, or suspected it closely enough to make the same calculation. And he had chosen to communicate his awareness not through an official summons or an open accusation, both of which would require process, witnesses, the machinery of court, but through this. A collapsed girl and a folded note. Intimate, untraceable. The language of a man who did not need to raise his voice because he had never been in a room where anyone could stop him. She helped Petra inside and settled her on the window seat with a blanket and cold water for the bruising at her temple. And she tended to her with the sharp, focused care of a woman who was not going to let herself feel the full weight of her terror until everyone around her was safe. Then she sat at her writing desk and she thought. She thought about Lord Edric's 12 minutes with the Duchess's secretary. She thought about the plain gold pin that did not belong to Petra. She thought about a room full of encrypted documents and 3 years of patient assembly. She thought about a man who trembled, barely perceptibly, when he spoke of his murdered father, and who had nevertheless stood in that study with the composure of someone who had decided, long before this moment, that composure was the price of justice. And she thought she was not going to make it to dawn if she stayed here. She also thought with a clarity that surprised her with its completeness that she did not intend to make it to dawn alone. The king's summons came at 2 hours past midnight. A palace steward, polite and impassive as furniture, stood at her door with a folded message bearing the royal seal. He did not wait for a reply. The summons of a king did not require confirmation, it required compliance, but simply bowed and withdrew, leaving the note in her hands. She dressed carefully, not in the automatic way of habit, but with deliberate intention, the dark blue gown that was formal without being festal, her hair arranged simply, no jewelry except the small gold earrings that had been her mother's, and which she wore as a kind of talisman in moments that required courage. She chose her appearance the way a soldier chose armor, not for beauty, but for what it communicated to the man who looked at her. King Aldric's private solar was smaller than the throne room by design, intimate, the architecture of personal authority rather than institutional display. The walls were hung in deep burgundy, the fire burning high despite the season, casting everything in warm amber light that would have looked welcoming in another context. The king was seated at a wide table when she entered. He was not a physically imposing man, medium height, careful posture. the kind of distinguished, well-maintained appearance that said comfort and power rather than strength. He had his mother's eyes, they said at court, dark, thoughtful, beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. He looked up when she entered and smiled. It was an excellent smile. She hated it. Lady Elara. He gestured to the chair across from him. Please sit. I've been meaning to find a quiet moment to speak with you. She sat. Her hands rested in her lap, loose and open. I find myself in the fortunate position, the king continued, of having received a rather flattering inquiry about you. Lord Fenwick, you know Fenwick, I believe. A fine man has expressed significant interest in a match. He's seen you at court over the past months, and has been quite taken. He folded his hands on the table with the ease of a man for whom power has long since become invisible to himself. I have, with your guardian's permission, and she has given it. I'm pleased to say agreed in principle to a betrothal. The formal announcement would be made at the week's closing banquet. He slid a document across the table. It bore 2 signatures already, the king's and the Duchess Margrave's. Elara looked at the document without touching it. Lord Fenwick's estate. She knew exactly where it was. Northern border territory, remote, difficult to reach in winter. And she had catalogued this 3 years ago, when a young duchess from the capital had traveled there and simply ceased to correspond with anyone, the kind of place from which people did not return. This is generous, she said. It is, the king agreed pleasantly. I would need time to consider. The decision has already been made. Still smiling. Still pleasant. Still looking at her with those dark, beautiful eyes that had nothing in them but calculation. You would depart at dawn. Lord Fenwick has arranged an escort already. It would be deeply inconvenient to alter those arrangements. He held her gaze. She held his. Both of them, in the warm amber firelight of the private solar, understood exactly what this conversation was about and what it was not, and what would happen to a young woman who chose the wrong response to a king who had already signed her death warrant and dressed it in the language of matrimonial honor. I understand, she said. Wonderful. He rose, signaling the conversation's end. I'm so pleased you came to court this season, Lady Elara. Your father would have been proud of how you've managed. She stood, inclined her head, and left the room. She walked back through the marble corridors of the palace with her face absolutely still and her heart beating the precise, measured pace of a woman who had already begun to plan. She did not sleep. She sat at the window of her chamber and listened to the palace settle into its nocturnal silence, the gradual dimming of corridor torches, the last footsteps of late servants, the settling of old stone, and she considered her options with the same rigorous honesty her father had modeled for her all her life. There were not many. The Duchess Margrave had signed that contract without consultation, which meant either complicity or cowardice, and in this situation both amounted to the same thing. She had no other formal protector at court. She had knowledge that could destroy a king, and a king who intended to bury her with it. She thought about running. She calculated it quickly and rejected it equally quickly. Alone, with resources she could carry on her person, she would be intercepted before she cleared the city. Lord Edric had not come to court for decoration. She thought about the documents in Cassian's study, about 3 years of collected evidence, about her father's testimony, which she had read enough of to know its weight, about the High Regent's Council, which existed precisely for situations where a king's authority required external check. She thought about a tall man in charcoal gray, with a tremor in his hand, when he spoke of his father. She did not know if she trusted Cassian Vael. She knew she trusted him more than she trusted anyone else in this palace, and she knew that in the particular calculus of survival, that was enough. She was still sitting at the window when the sound came, 3 quiet, precise taps at her chamber door, evenly spaced, that carried in their pattern exactly the measured control she had come to associate with one person. She crossed to the door and opened it. Cassian stood in the corridor in a travel cloak, dark, heavy, the hood pushed back. Behind him, at the far end of the passage, a palace servant she did not recognize held a torch. In the servant's other hand, reins. 2 horses, their breath visible in the cold draft from the side door. Cassian looked at her. He said 4 words. You will not go. And something in the certainty of his voice, not commanding, not performative, but absolute in the way that things are absolute when they come from a place beyond decision, from something that has already decided before the mind catches up, did something to her chest that she did not have time to catalogue. She looked at him. She looked at the horses. She looked back at him. I'll need my coat, she said. Something moved through his expression that she had never seen on him before. It looked very much like relief. They rode in the dark before dawn, following the servants' access road that ran along the western edge of the palace grounds and joined the trade route 3 miles south of the city wall. Cassian rode ahead, setting the pace fast enough to cover ground, measured enough to avoid the recklessness that attracted attention. Elara rode just behind him and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say, and because she was doing what she always did in moments that demanded precise thinking, memorizing everything: the route, the landmarks, the quality of the darkness which was beginning at its eastern edge to gray. They had been riding perhaps 40 minutes when Cassian slowed and fell into pace beside her. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me several," she replied. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Something that might become one in a different season. The study," he said. "The documents. Everything I have been doing for 3 years." He paused, the hooves of their horses striking a rhythm against the packed earth. "My mother was Elsbeth of the House Caran. My father was King Renard Not, a ceremonial figure, not a regent, but the crowned and legitimate king of this realm. He married my mother privately, before his formal marriage to Aldrich's mother was arranged by the council. That marriage was valid, witnessed by your father, among others. She absorbed this. The fever, she said, administered, he said. Your father had documented the symptoms in his private notes from the night of my father's death. He recognized the compound a slow mineral poison, colorless, tasteless, entirely consistent with fever in its presentation. He had intended to present his findings at the inquiry. He was removed from the palace 2 days before it convened. She was quiet for a moment. The road curved away from the tree line and opened onto a stretch of low fields, and the gray at the horizon had deepened. Dawn was perhaps an hour away. He never told me, she said. In all the years, he never said what he knew. He was protecting you. The words fell into the pre-dawn air and stayed there. She had known in some part of herself she had not permitted herself to examine too closely, that her father's death was not what the record said. She had known it as she knew her own heartbeat, not proven, not documented, but felt with a certainty that evidence would only confirm. She had spent 8 years living beside that knowledge and not touching it, because touching it led only to places she could not safely go alone. You have been building toward the council, she said. Yes. The High Regent's Council has the authority to suspend royal power pending formal inquiry. It does. But to convene it, you need a majority of the High Lords. And to get that majority, you need evidence that cannot be dismissed or buried. Yes, he glanced at her. I have nearly everything. The physician's notes, the witness testimonies from my mother's household, the original marriage document, authenticated. What I am missing, he said, after a pause that cost him something she could see clearly even in the gray half-light, is your father's testimony. She turned to look at him. He wrote a formal deposition, Cassian said. Before he left the palace, he gave it to the one person he trusted to keep it safe. I have spent 3 years trying to locate it. He paused again. The person he gave it to was not me. Who? He held her gaze, and something in his expression shifted into something honest and difficult in the way that honesty is difficult when it comes bundled with things you have not yet fully processed. Octavia, he said. Elara's whole body went still. The Queen Dowager, yes. The woman who... She stopped. Yes, he said again, quietly. I know. The river crossing came at dawn. It was a low stone bridge on the southern trade route, wide enough for carts, where the river ran narrow but fast over dark rocks. The bridge was unguarded at this hour on most mornings. This morning it was not. 4 riders emerged from the tree line on the far bank as Elara and Cassian reached the approach. They wore no livery, but their formation was disciplined, their horses well-trained, their faces the blank, professional impassivity of men who had been paid well and asked nothing. Cassian drew rein immediately. Elara did the same and then, in the space of 2 heartbeats, did something that was not the reflexive panic of a frightened woman. She took in the width of the bridge, the depth and speed of the river, the positions of the 4 riders, the angle of morning light, the lay of the bank to their left, and the quality of the tree line to their right. Her father had taught her to read terrain the way he taught her to read documents. Not for pleasure, for survival. Turn left, she said. Cassian looked at her. The riverbank. She kept her voice completely level. There's a ford approximately half a mile east. The water is lower there. I can see it in the channel's color. The tree line gives cover for most of the distance. How do you know there's a ford? Because the trade route bends back to cross the river a mile south of this bridge, she said. and the distance only makes sense if the original route used an easier crossing that predated the bridge. Old routes always leave traces in the land. The channel narrows upstream. He stared at her for half a second. Then he turned his horse left without another word. She pulled alongside him as they moved along the bank, the 4 riders beginning to follow at a controlled pace across the bridge behind them. The ford was where she said it would be, a wide, shallow gravel crossing where the river spread and slowed, deep only at its center and easily navigable for horses that trusted their riders. They crossed in under a minute. The pursuing horses reached the bank as they entered the tree line on the far side. Cassian looked at her through the filtered morning light between the branches. "Who taught you to read terrain?" he asked. "The same person who taught me everything else," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Your father was extraordinary," he said. "I know," she said. And for the first time since the study, since the note pinned to Petra's collar, since the king's amber-lit smile for the first time in days, she felt the beginning of something that was not fear. Something that sat in the chest differently. Something like the particular stillness of a person who has found, after a long stumbling solid ground. The safe house was a stone hunting lodge on the edge of Cassian's private estate, small, low-windowed, set back from the track by a quarter-mile of dense birch. From the road, it was invisible. From the inside, it had one clear sightline to the approach and a secondary exit through the rear, concealed by the woodpile. Elara had been taking in its details for exactly 90 seconds since they dismounted when the rear door opened. She stopped. The woman who stepped through was older than Elara had imagined, perhaps 60, upright and unhurried in her bearing, dressed in plain traveling clothes that could not quite conceal the authority they covered. Silver hair, drawn back. Dark eyes that held the particular exhausted quality of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. Queen Dowager Octavia. Elara's first instinct was anger. She was aware of it precisely because she had learned to be aware of her instincts before they moved her. She let it exist and held still. "You know why she's here," Cassian said quietly behind her. "I'm beginning to," Elara said. Octavia crossed the room and stood before Elara and looked at her with those dark, exhausted eyes, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was controlled and careful and carrying beneath it the specific texture of a woman saying something she had rehearsed and revised many times, "Your father came to me the night before he was taken. He knew what was coming. He had ways of knowing things. Your father. He gave me the deposition with his own hands. He said to keep it until it was needed." She paused. "He said the time would announce itself." Elara looked at her. "He trusted you," she said. "After everything you did." Octavia did not flinch. "No," she said. "He trusted that I would have to live with what I had done for long enough, that it would eventually make me useful." She paused. "He was a precise man, your father." "He was," Elara said. "He was the best man I have ever known." The words cost her. She felt them leave her with the weight of 8 years behind them, and she held herself completely steady through the leaving of them. Octavia moved to the table in the center of the room and drew out a sealed document, thick vellum, intact, the seal bearing the court physician's mark. Elara looked at it for a long time. Then she lifted her gaze to Octavia's face. "He wrote it all," she said. "Everything," Octavia confirmed. "The compound, the timeline, the ordered absence from the inquiry, the conversation he had with King Aldrich 3 days before his own removal from the palace, in which Aldrich told him directly, and without ambiguity, that a physician who could not keep the peace was a physician the realm did not need." She paused. He also included evidence that the annulment of Renard's first marriage was fabricated forged documents presented to a council that was told they were authentic. Cassian had moved to the window. His back was to the room. His hands were folded behind him, and she could see even at this distance, even from behind the controlled, particular stillness of a man receiving the confirmation of something he has known all his life, and still has to metabolize every time it is spoken aloud. She crossed to him without quite deciding to. She stood beside him at the window and said nothing, and after a moment she placed her hand over his, where it rested against the sill. He looked down at her hand. Then he turned his palm beneath hers and held it, not dramatically, not with the performed tenderness of a man making a point, simply held it. "Can we take this to the council?" she asked. "With the deposition," he said, "and the additional witnesses Octavia has gathered, yes. We have enough." He paused. "We have more than enough." She nodded. "He will try to stop you," she said. "He will try to stop us," he said. She noticed the correction. She let herself notice it. They spent 2 days at the lodge, planning with the careful precision that the situation demanded. During those days she came to know things about Cassian Vael that the palace version of him had never allowed, the way he moved through a space quietly, as though trained in childhood not to take up more room than necessary. The way he read, which was the same way she read, completely eyes still, the rest of him absent. The way he made coffee without ceremony and handed her a cup each morning without asking how she took it, because he had already noticed. The way he sat across from her at the planning table, late into the first evening, and said, very suddenly, "You're not afraid of any of this." It wasn't a question. "Of course I'm afraid of it," she said, without looking up from the documents. "I'm simply not going to let it make decisions for me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father taught you that too?" "No," she said. "I learned that one myself." Something changed in his face. At that something quiet and private, and not intended for public consumption, that was there and then was managed, before he looked back at the documents. But she had seen it. She was beginning to think that the most important things about Cassian Vael existed in exactly that space, in what appeared, and was then managed, in what the mask slipped just enough to reveal before he assembled it again. She was beginning to think she wanted to know what all of it looked like, unmanaged. She was beginning to think with the particular combination of clarity and alarm that only the most honest kinds of wanting carry that she might be a very long time finding out. The night before the council session, Cassian spread his maps across the table and walked her through the chamber layout, the Lord's seating positions, the procedural rights that governed emergency sessions under ancient law. He was methodical and exact, as she had come to expect. What she had not expected was the moment, perhaps an hour into their planning, when he paused mid-sentence and simply looked at her in a way that was not calculating, not assessing, but something else entirely, and said, quietly, "You don't have to go in with me. I'm the only one who can deliver the deposition by testimony," she said. "You know that. Written evidence from a deceased physician carries a fraction of the weight of living witness." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you not to come. I'm telling you that you don't have to. There's a difference." She looked at him across the table, in the low firelight of the safe house, with the maps between them, and Octavia asleep in the back room, and the whole terrible weight of the thing they were about to do sitting quietly in the air. "I know there's a difference," she said. "I'm choosing to come." He nodded, and then, with the specificity of a man who has decided that this is the moment, he said, "Elara," just her name. No title. She waited. "I want you to understand something," he said carefully. "Everything I arranged, the invitation list, the circumstances in the study, all of it I arranged before I knew you. What I mean is, I arranged it for a piece in a larger plan, for a witness, a function, an element I needed. I did not arrange it for you." He paused. "I need you to know that what I feel now is not part of any arrangement. It is—" He stopped, and she could see him choosing between the word he wanted and the word he calculated was appropriate, and then, with obvious effort, setting the calculation aside, "It is the most inconvenient, unexpected, and entirely unmanaged thing that has happened to me in 3 years of managing everything." Elara looked at him for a long moment. "Cassian," she said. "Yes." "I know," she said simply. He exhaled just barely, just enough to be perceptible, and looked back at the maps. And she understood, with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything, that this was not the conversation's ending. It was its beginning. It could afford to be brief tonight, because they were both still here, and they would both still be here tomorrow, and the night after. For the first time in a long time, she was thinking in those terms. Tomorrow, and the night after. She was also thinking about the stain she'd noticed on his coat during their ride, a bruise on his knuckles he hadn't mentioned, which meant there had already been at least one moment on the road she hadn't been told about. She filed this under things she intended to revisit. She was becoming, she suspected, very good at filing things under Cassian. And beside her, for the first time in the careful, measured, controlled presence she had come to know, Cassian Vael did something she had not seen him do before. He smiled, fully without managing it, and it changed his face entirely. The hall of the High Regent's Council had the architecture of accountability-wide, stone-vaulted, lit by high windows admitting cold morning light in slanted columns across the long table surrounded by 16 high lords in their formal colors. At the head, in the designated chair, sat King Aldrich. He had arrived with 6 guards and a private secretary and the composed, dangerous precision of a man who had been managing this kind of threat for 2 decades. He had not, Elara suspected, anticipated her. She entered the chamber beside Cassian, and the room's temperature changed in the way that rooms change when something not expected enters them. She was aware of eyes assessing, curious, calculating. She was aware of Aldrich's gaze hitting her with a specific, controlled fury that was very carefully not showing on his face. She was aware of Lord Edric, seated behind the king's chair, whose pleasant, forgettable features had arranged themselves into something sharp and still. She walked to the floor position before the council's table, and she stood there with her hands loose at her sides, and she said clearly, "My name is Elara Oren. My father was Dr. Aldred Oren, court physician to this realm for 22 years. I am here to present, in formal session and before the assembled authority of the High Regent's Council, a sworn deposition authored and sealed by my father, and supplementary testimony in support of Duke Cassian Vael's formal grievance against the present occupant of this throne." The room erupted. She waited. When it quieted, and it did, because the ancient protocol of council session demanded quiet, and even kings could not strip that particular right from the room, she continued. She had memorized the deposition in its entirety during those 2 days at the lodge. She delivered its contents from memory, in the ordered, precise, devastating sequence. Her father had constructed the medical evidence first, the timeline second, the conversation with Aldrich third, with direct quotation. The words fell into the cold morning air like stones dropping into still water, each one sending its ring outward through the silence. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not look at the king. She did not need to. She could feel him across the room with the specific, prickling awareness of a woman who has been in the presence of a man, trying to contain himself and failing by inches. By the time she reached the final section, the testimony regarding the forged annulment documents, the fabricated grounds that had stripped a 9-year-old boy of his father and his birthright, she could hear, in the quality of the chamber's silence, exactly what was happening to the room. The High Lords were not performing their consideration. They were genuinely moving through it. Lord Carveth, at the table's south end, had stopped writing and was simply watching her. Lord Pembridge, who had served the throne for 30 years and was known across the continent for the rigidity of his loyalties, had his hands folded on the table in front of him, and his gaze fixed in the middle distance with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood. Aldrich's first attempt to speak came during the section on the poison compound. He rose from his chair and said, with impressive composure, that the testimony of a dead man delivered second-hand from a woman with clear personal grievance constituted neither evidence nor testimony under council law. The council chair asked Lady Elara to pause. Then he asked the king, with the measured politeness of a man who has spent 40 years navigating royal temperament, whether His Majesty was formally objecting to the witness on procedural grounds, which would require him to specify the rule violated. Aldrich sat down. His second attempt came when Elara reached the section documenting the fabricated annulment. He said, with somewhat less composure, that the document she was citing had been reviewed and authenticated by the council's own legal body 20 years prior. Cassian, from his position beside the clerk's table, produced the authentication record in question. He produced, beside it, the signed statement of the authenticating notary, now retired, now beyond royal reach, describing the pressure under which the authentication had been conducted. Aldrich's third attempt was not a legal objection. It was simply his voice, tight and quiet, and stripped of its usual pleasantness. "This is theater," Lord Carveth, from the south end of the table, said without looking up from the documents before him. "With respect, Your Majesty, theater does not typically produce authenticated marriage records, signed notary depositions, and the sealed testimony of a deceased court physician. I am finding this to be considerably more than theater." The chamber went very still after that. When she finished, the chamber held its silence for a full 10 seconds. Then Cassian stepped forward beside her and placed his own evidence before the clerk, the sealed documents from the study, the witness testimonies from his mother's household, the authentication of his parents' marriage, and spoke in his precise, measured way about what they amounted to. Aldrich attempted to speak 3 times. Each time the council chair invoked procedure and asked him to wait. The vote for suspension of royal authority pending formal inquiry took 11 minutes to conduct. The majority was not close. Elara stood through it with her hands loose at her sides and her face still, and watched the king's composure finally, precisely, come apart, not in rage, but in the particular, terrible quietness of a man watching a structure collapse. that he had built his entire life inside of. When it was done, Lord Carveth rose from his chair and crossed the chamber and stood before her, and said, in the tone of a man who is saying something he recognizes as overdue, "Your father would have been proud, my lady." She inclined her head. "He would have called it simply accurate," she said, and somewhere in her chest, something that had been held in compression for 8 years released itself quietly and with great gentleness, like a door being opened from the inside. The courtyard outside the council chambers was bright with autumn light when they emerged, and Elara stood in it and breathed the particular, specific quality of air after something terrible has been concluded, sharp and cold and real, in the way that only open air after a long confinement is real. Cassian stood beside her. The courtyard was filling with the footsteps and murmured conversations of lords and their households filtering out of the session, some moving toward them, some deliberately not, the political landscape rearranging itself in real time around the morning's events. Elara observed it the way she observed everything. She was still cataloging. She thought she might never stop. Then Cassian spoke. "I should have told you," he said, "before any of this." "Told me what?" "That I knew who you were before you came to court this season." He held her gaze. "I had been searching for your father's deposition for 2 years. When I learned you were attending the Duchess Margrave's household, I had reason to believe you might know where it was. I made certain your name appeared on the Duchess's invitation list. She absorbed this. You arranged for me to be here." Yes. She considered him this impossible, careful, complicated man who had spent 3 years building a case in silence, and who had, it now emerged, been several moves ahead of where she'd thought the board was. "And the study," she said. "The lock on the study door," he said carefully, "had not been changed in 6 months. I had been considering for some time whether to arrange for someone with the right capabilities to find themselves in a position to access what was inside. A pausa. I had not, to be clear, anticipated that the means of that access would be quite so catastrophically accidental, spontaneous," he finished. With that fractional movement at the corner of his mouth she had come to understand was him trying not to smile. "The flagstone was a contingency. I did not know you would find it, but you weren't entirely surprised." He said nothing, which was its own answer. She looked at the courtyard around them, the morning light, the lords in their formal colors, the ancient stones of the council building, the particular irreversible quality of a morning that had changed something beyond changing back, and then she looked at him. "You could have told me," she said, "at any point." "Yes," he said, "I could have." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because," he said, "I needed you to choose it, not because I put you in position to. Not because I needed you, but because you decided, with full information and no pressure, that this was worth fighting for." His voice was quiet. "I needed it to be your choice." She was quiet. Something moved through her that was not the analytical clarity she had been living inside of for the past week. Something warmer and more dangerous than analysis. Something she had been, she realized, very carefully not examining since the first night on the terrace when he stood at the balustrade and showed her the tremor in his hand and did not pretend it wasn't there. "It was my choice," she said. "I know. The choice was mine from the moment I read that document," she said. "I would have done this regardless of you." "I know that too," he said. "Good." She paused. "Then we understand each other." "We do," he said. And then, in the open courtyard in the autumn light, before the high lords and their households and the assembled machinery of a realm in transition, Cassian Vael did something that was not strategically calculated or politically managed or part of any plan she had been shown. He turned to face her fully, this man who had spent 3 years being precise about everything, and he said, in a voice that was low enough to be private, but clear enough to be heard by every person within 10 feet. "Lady Elara Oren, you are the most extraordinary person I have encountered in my life. You are under my protection, formally and publicly, for as long as you will permit it. And if you will permit it to be more than protection, a pause, weighted, honest, the kind of pause that a man allows only when he has decided that the risk of the words is less than the risk of their absence, then I would consider myself more fortunate than anything my title or my lineage has ever brought me." The courtyard had gone very quiet. Elara looked at him. She thought about the sealed room and the document and her father's name, and the terrible week that had followed. She thought about a man who had been carrying this alone for 3 years. She thought about the tremor in his hand and the way he had, without discussion, turned his palm beneath hers at the window of the safe house, and simply held on. She thought about the full, unmanaged smile that had changed his face entirely, and the 2 cups of coffee made without asking because he had already noticed. She took a breath. "Ask me properly," she said, "when we are not standing in a courtyard surrounded by 30 witnesses." Something moved through his expression, relief and amusement, and something deeper and quieter underneath both. "Name the time and place," he said. "Tonight," she said. "When this is finished." He nodded. She thought about what it meant that he had arranged all of this, and had still, at every critical turn, given her a choice. The invitation to court, the unlocked study. 4 words at her door in the dark: "You will not go." Not a command. A statement of his own intention, which she was free to refuse. She had not been naive about it. She had seen the architecture of his planning clearly enough. But planning and care were not the same thing, and she had spent enough time in his company over those 2 days at the lodge to know the difference. He had given her the information she needed to say no at every stage. He had, in fact, given her more information than strategy required. That was not a man deploying an asset. That was a man who had decided, somewhere between the study and the terrace and the hunting lodge, that her understanding mattered more to him than his outcome. She was not, she realized, going to be making him wait long past tonight. She was also not going to tell him that yet, because watching Cassian Vael be patient about something he cared about was, she had discovered, one of the more quietly extraordinary things she had ever witnessed. She turned back to the courtyard, and the morning, and the work that was still to be done. And then she noticed the sleeve. It was a small thing, a darkening of the charcoal gray fabric above his left wrist, visible only because she was standing close enough, and because she had spent a week learning to read the details that most people did not look for. The stain was dark and wet at its center and drying at its edges. Recent, an hour old at most. She looked at it. She looked at him. He met her eyes. "It's minor," he said quietly. "When?" "At the chamber service entrance, before we entered the session." He held her gaze. "Edric's man. He didn't succeed." She was very still for a moment. "You went into the session while you were—" "There was no other option," he said. "The session could not be delayed." She looked at the stain on his sleeve. She looked at his face, that controlled, careful, precise face that had been managing extraordinary things for longer than she had known him, and she felt, with complete and sudden clarity, that the thing she had been not examining was not going to remain unexamined for much longer. That she did not, in fact, want it to. "Tonight," she said again. There was something different in the word this time. Not a boundary, a promise. "Tonight," he confirmed quietly, and the word in his voice carried the same thing. She turned back to the courtyard, and the conversation, and the 30 witnesses, and the autumn light, and the world that was, with very careful and hard-won precision, beginning to become something different. But she did not stop noticing the stain on his sleeve. And Cassian, watching her profile in the morning light the still composure, the cataloging eyes, the controlled and brilliant mind that had walked into a sealed room and changed everything, thought that the danger was not yet over. He was right about that. It never entirely was, in a world like theirs. There would be more of Edric's men. There would be the formal inquiry, the political unraveling, the long and careful work of dismantling 20 years of constructed power. There would be mornings harder than this one. But beside him, steady and precise and entirely herself, was a woman who had been trained since girlhood to read the room before the room read her, who had held her father's testimony in memory for 8 years without ever having known it, who had stood before 16 lords of the realm and delivered 40 minutes of devastating precision, and then walked into the autumn light and asked to be asked properly. Cassian Vael had spent 3 years learning patience. He thought, looking at her, that it had been the best investment he had ever made. If this story moved something in you, if you felt Elara's grief and her quiet, unbreakable courage, if you held your breath through the council chamber and found yourself wanting them both to be safe, then you already know what makes this kind of story matter. It is not just entertainment. It is the kind of story that makes you feel something true about loyalty, about survival, about what it costs to carry the truth for 8 years, and then choose, when the moment finally comes, to speak it. Stories built on courage, devotion, and love that is earned, rather than given. This channel exists for exactly that. For the women who survive what should have broken them. For the men whose carefully constructed walls come down in the presence of someone worth being honest with. For every story that says, the truth is worth the cost and love is worth the risk. If you want to be here for the next one, the next woman who discovers what she was never meant to know, the next man whose silent, fierce devotion finally finds its voice, then hit subscribe. It takes 1 second, and it means you will never miss what comes next. And leave us a comment. Tell us, at what moment did you know Cassian had already decided she was worth everything? Was it the terrace, when he let her see the tremor in his hand? Was it the courtyard, when he said she was the most extraordinary person he had ever met? Or was it somewhere quieter, somewhere in the spaces between the words, where the most important things always live? This is a community for people who believe that the most powerful stories are about courage, about choosing truth even when the crown demands your silence, about love that is built not on convenience, but on the willingness to stand beside someone in the most dangerous room in the world. You belong here. Subscribe and stay a while.